was asked to say a few words at the beginning here about trends in our industry, and that's always a little bit challenging because a trend and a prediction are not exactly the same thing. A prediction actually tries to project trends into the future and understand why they're happening. But when we look at a trend, we're looking at data from a particular perspective, and we're trying to understand what might be behind that data. And so whatever perspective you come from colors your understanding of what constitutes a trend and where that trend might actually be heading. And that's why you get directions like this sign. I want to talk a little bit about the kinds of things that are behind the trends that we do see. First of all, we know that there's a lot of cost driving change in our industry. There's the promise of new technology, and you add to that the explosive volume of content being developed around the world and the penetration of markets around the world. And the result of that is that customers have expectations far beyond what is reasonable to deliver on the part of translators, both in terms of volume and in terms of overall cost. And so that drives change. If you think about a chart looking something like this, where the volume of material to be translated goes on sort of forever, and the value of that individual translation differs based on what type of translation it is. And so there's a certain budget that is currently devoted to human translation. And there is a lot of pressure on that budget, both from the standpoint to reduce the overall expenditure so that they can move it out, and then also the need to have more and more material translated. And so technology promises to help with that. Technology doesn't always deliver on that promise, but it does promise. There's workflow automation to try and make us more efficient. There's machine translation that is designed to try to improve productivity as well as extend the application. There are several open market projects out there now that are trying to connect people with translation needs directly with translators. Virtual teams is something that's coming up more and more, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but this is where 2 or 3 or 7 translators and subject matter experts and maybe a technologist get together to operate as a team on a project without benefit of any translation company being involved. And then, of course, community translation, which is the polite word for crowdsourcing. But what we may see developing over time is something like this, where we have a post-editing, machine translation post-editing volume that lowers the cost and improves productivity. You have virtual teams providing transcreation and other sorts of higher value efforts. Then you have communities who get engaged to help translation for themselves, essentially. We already see that, for instance, with places like Intel and Microsoft that are having their customer support pages translated by the customers themselves. That's a good trick if you can get it done. And then there are times when raw machine translation is the only thing you can afford, and it's better than no translation. So we see something like this going on. We'll see. Another thing that really is driving the kinds of changes we're seeing in our industry is this drive towards mobility. This is a chart, the details are going to be very hard to see, but this is a chart that begins with personal computers as sort of the first time that we were able to get mobile in our business. It was about 2000 or 2001 here that I began to use coffee shops as my office space instead of the office, because I could carry my portable computer. Wasn't as light as the one I have now, but I could carry my portable computer and hook up to the internet and get my work done. But the blue there picks up with smartphones, and you can see how much more rapid the uptake of smartphones are, things like iPhones and Blackberries. How many of you, just out of curiosity, how many of you here have what would be considered a smartphone? Something that you can take pictures and get on the internet, and pretty much more powerful than the portable computers that they had back here at the left end. That was most of you, by the way, if you didn't notice. And then we're just beginning to see tablets. I did notice a few of these iPads and other things around today, and some of the projections are that iPads will actually have a steeper uptake than smartphones. And all that means that there's more possibilities for people trying to bring content to you. There are more opportunities for you to engage content in your favorite language, and there's more money for someone to make somewhere, and that drives a lot of change in our industry as people are trying to deal with that. We then have, a driver of change always is innovation, and technology innovation is kind of old news, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about that. We have process innovation that also needs to go on, though, in our business. You've heard a lot about this translation edit proof process being replaced by machine translation and post-editing. That, I think, is a little bit of an oversimplification, but what is very clear is that processes that were developed in the 1980s when things were still very, very manual are not likely to be helpful in the 21st century, where the velocity of translation is so much greater. We just have to deal with some innovation in our processes. And then the key, I think, is innovation in our business models as LSPs, because if you look at things, it's not until there's a commercial driver for some of these technology and process innovations that things really start moving. I remember hearing Jochen Hummel, who is one of the founders of Trados, speak about a year and a half ago at the Gala meeting, and he pointed out that it wasn't until they figured out how to create that nice little Trados matrix that we all rely on now for fuzzy matches and so forth. It wasn't until they figured out how to present that to the customers in terms of a monetary discount on things that people began to actually use the new technology. You'd think that the actual ability to look up the previous matches in translation memory and that productivity would have made a difference, but it wasn't until there was a business model change that it really moved that. The other thing is that in all sorts of industries, innovation in business model is more likely to come from outside than from inside, and that's a lesson we ought to take to heart. Harvard Business Review had a paper last December that pointed out that most organizations shrink or disappear over time because of various pressures: political, economic, social, technology change. And so if we keep doing what we've been doing, someone else will do something else, right? If we keep doing what we've been doing, someone else will do something else, and we'll become obsolete. So, as I said, the idea of trends comes from different perspectives, so I decided to get a little help from my friends, and I talked to people in different places in the world. This was not a scientific study. This was not random. This was not intended to be representative. These are just people I knew well enough to say, what do you think? And there are people from different aspects of the business in different parts of the world, and I thought it might be helpful to look at that. So one perspective, you probably have heard of this guy, but Renato, who is currently the Chief Marketing Officer at Moravia, gave me his top three. He says, first of all, he's seeing a rise of micro-translations, very small bits of source from a few words to a few sentences, usually without context, and usually with a very short turnaround time. And by the way, usually much smaller than translators usually have for their minimum charge. So that's a trend that he's seeing a lot in his work. The other thing he brought up was this outsourcing to translator teams, and in fact, he sort of threatened me. He says, you tell those Russians to gather themselves up into groups of 5 or 7, and don't worry about translation companies. So I've done that. I'm not sure I agree with him completely. But his point is that with the kinds of opportunities we have in technology today, the barriers to competition are lower than they've ever been before. 3 or 4 or 5 smart people who are willing to work together on something can suddenly compete effectively with a company that's been around for 10 or 15 years. And we all need to take that seriously. The third point, the trend that he saw was an increasing in demand for so-called long-tail languages, these languages that are less widely used. And so that's perhaps good news if you happen to be dealing with some of those languages. It may be irrelevant if you're dealing with French, Italian, German, and Spanish. So another perspective I got was this guy, Kirti Vashee, who is chief evangelist or something. He calls himself vice president of enterprise translation sales at Asia Online. And you might imagine, by the way, all these people have their own biases, and this you'll see here. But Kirti is telling us that we're seeing increasing success for machine translation when it's very specifically trained in a target domain, not just a language. He also sees, and I would certainly agree with these next 2 points, a much better understanding of what's involved in post-editing and how that differs from normal translation, and a much better understanding of how to measure the quality of machine translation in a way that makes sense. It turns out that a blue score is pretty much just a color. It doesn't really help you with understanding the productivity or even how well you can understand things. And so we need to go to deeper in quality metrics. And he also is seeing a lot of people who have tried out some of these do-it-yourself Moses solutions, turning back to the commercial vendors who have a much deeper understanding of what's actually involved in machine translation. One of my favorite heroes, which is the American comic strip Dilbert, and the Dilbert manager, he has this saying that anything that I do not understand is easy, right? And we all, yes, we all sort of have that. We all have a hard job, and everybody else's job is easy, but it turns out that sometimes the other guy's job is hard too, and so that's driving some work to commercial MT vendors. Another perspective I got was Angelika Zefass, who has been training translators and translation companies in how to use various tools for a very long time. And she's also been preaching the importance of terminology management for a very long time, and she says that's finally getting some traction. I think, by the way, that this is related somewhat to the machine translation, because good terminology management actually helps you with your domain-specific training. She also points out that we're getting more and more new kinds of content. This is related to that mobility thing that I told you about earlier. Social networking, Twitter, Instagram, things like that. You know, what do you do with a tweet when you're trying to use your standard processes? What file prep do you use for a tweet? You know, what about standard terminology there? A lot of these things just don't fit the old processes. And then she also points out that in the more professional document-oriented space, the file types are getting increasingly more complex from the standpoint of a translator. They actually are getting somewhat simplified from the standpoint of a computer programmer. But what that means, again, is that the old processes need to be modified, and there needs to be some additional automated workflow that's made possible by these changes, but that also means that additional types of people need to be involved in the process. You've heard Jost referred to earlier. Jost just gave me two, but they're two good ones. He's seeing, from the translator perspective, a much deeper integration of machine translation into workflows. This is something that people have talked about for a long time, but more and more it really is happening. And part of that is the technology of getting the automated workflows in place, some of the translation management systems like you heard about earlier. And some of it is just people realizing that in the right application, you really can get 50% more done or twice as much done in the same amount of time. The other thing he pointed out is that there's a really limited lifespan for LSPs who are only middlemen in the process. This gets back to Renato's comment about virtual teams and the overall theme of cost compression and cost being squeezed out of the process. If as an LSP, the only thing you are is sort of a standalone vendor manager, in other words, if the only thing you do is you have a long list of names of translators that you will provide for a 20% markup or a 50% markup or whatever it is, those translators are going to figure out how to provide direct, and you're going to be out of the loop. So that I don't think that's bad news for single language vendors. In fact, I believe that the single language vendors have a much brighter future if they'll step up and provide real value. But it does mean that if all you're doing is a middleman, then you ought to start planning your retirement. So I also talked to a couple of people in the end buyer space. And they're seeing, again, demand for continuous translation with very little context. This is the same thing that Renato referred to as micro-translation. The specific example that someone gave me was, I might have one sentence with 8 words that gets used 1,000 different places on my website. You're not going to give the translator 1,000 contexts. So he also pointed out, the same guy, as a matter of fact, pointed out that we're really going to see declining quality expectations. Why is that? Well, a couple of different factors. One, as we all accommodate ourselves to the Twitterverse, a couple of things going on there. First of all, in 140 characters, I can't spell everything correctly, right? I have to make choices about which letters to leave out so I can say more. The other thing is there's a real, even in our personal spaces, there's a real premium on timeliness. I want to be the first one that makes that smart comment about this news item that just happened. But that's happening throughout all modes of communication, and being first is more important than getting the grammar right. Getting the whole rapid distribution of ideas and information is way more important than careful, well thought out analysis and polished writing. We don't have time to read it. So, and then a couple of people brought out some of these themes, and someone else pointed out when I shared this with them that the machine translation is really going to help fill both of these gaps, because machine translation does a really good job at bad translation, right? We know that. But it does it quickly. And so, and furthermore, as people begin to fill that gap, these machine translation vendors are finally going to be able to monetize some of their effort, because people will begin to see the value. So they will see increasing price for some kinds of machine translation. And then I also got a few single language vendor or regional language vendors around the world to comment from their perspective. And they're seeing a greater use of machine translation. And interestingly enough, that's not a new trend for them, but I wanted to include it here. As the big guys started quietly using machine translation, the single language vendors were pretty much required to do that. There also is a more multifaceted approach to quality. People are beginning to realize that the translator isn't the best person to define what quality is. The buyer is, or more specifically, the buyer's customers. And so in an IT help page, raw machine translation with some very light post-editing might be all the quality you need. And we don't care about customer service, thank you very much, just get it done. Whereas if you're doing something in, say, the medical space, operating instructions for a large medical device of some kind, an MRI, you really do want the high quality, and you don't want even the possibility that someone will fail to catch an error of a machine translation. So there's a multifaceted approach there. Interestingly enough, they're seeing a real rise in demand for Russian, both as a target language and in some cases as a source language. And I thought that was certainly of interest here, and I suspect, based on information I've seen from Common Sense Advisory and elsewhere, that that really is a true trend. In other words, I think there was more growth in the Russian business, total business size in language services than pretty much any other region over the last year or two. So, congratulations. Price compression. That's something they're seeing. It really is going to drive either the small or the inefficient players out of business. If all you're doing is adding your margin and passing things along, that's going to get squeezed out. And that's just another way of saying that disintermediation, which is a made-up word, by the way, disintermediation is going to show up in various forms. So you see, on the one hand, a company like Lionbridge, who doesn't use single language vendors. They've got an army of vendor managers who are managing freelancers throughout the world. And on the other hand, you see some of the things that Moravia has done, at least in the past. And I know Laszlo is here, and I talked to him a little bit last night about that. And I think my information may be a little out of date on Moravia's plans, which is appropriate. But in the past, anyway, Moravia relied very heavily on single language vendors and expected them to deliver on the quality and capacity promises that they should have. And I think the key here is that we need to stop with 3 layers of redundant project management, and we need to have value added at each stage of the process, or we need to cut that process out. Because at the end of the day, the one thing you cannot cut out is the translator. And then there's a much greater demand, and this is, remember, from the single language vendor perspective, much greater demand for self-service portals. In other words, if you're going to get work from some companies, you have to get it yourself through their vendor manager portal. Customers are increasingly being asked to use automated approaches to entering data, which of course just has the customer do data entry for the provider, right? And as we get more and more web services interconnections here, I think we're going to have more and more of that. So I'm almost done here. I'll give you my top 4 and then one to go on. What I see from my perspective, pulling these things together and some of the other things I've seen, is that we really are undergoing a transition from a project orientation to a stream processing orientation. And the first person that pointed this out to me was actually David Philipp several years ago when he was still working at Moravia. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that was a real important insight. And over the last 2 or 3 years, I've helped 3 different companies move to a situation where they pre-process a stream of content that comes in from their customers in certain ways that make it easier for the customer. They use application programming interfaces for their business management systems to automatically open up hundreds of projects. They use exception reporting so that the project manager doesn't have to count those projects. They just have their attention called to the ones that aren't going well. And then they aggregate the stuff on the back end to send back to the customer as it's ready and invoice on a monthly basis. And so it looks to the customer like it's just an ongoing project that lasts for 5 years, and it looks to the computer as if it's several hundred projects, maybe even several thousand. But computers are good at counting, so we'll let them count them. And we'll just deal with serving the customer efficiently as we can. And I'm seeing this more and more as a transition. I am also seeing this increasing integration of MT, and just recently there was the announcement that the new Apple Map program on the new Apple iPhone 5 has built-in automatic translation. My first thought was that should be good humor, but who knows? It'll get better, and there's all sorts of things happening at the customer level. How long have we been doing, in some ways, post-editing and just no one told us? Well, yeah, the previous vendor didn't do a good job. Well, yeah, the previous vendor was Google, all right? And you can tell. So, but I think we are getting more sophisticated integration, and I think that needs to happen within our language service provider organizations as well. Once again, velocity is becoming more important than quality or price. There are a lot of things that if they're not done now, they don't need to be done at all. And I'm happy to pay for it if I can have it tomorrow. If you can't get it to you tomorrow, then never mind. And so I think if we prepare ourselves to be able to say yes to things like 24-hour turnaround, 36-hour turnaround, 6-hour turnaround on some things, then I think we can win. And then I see, frankly, an increasing reliance on global single language vendor and regional language vendors who really take responsibility for quality, for doing some of the file management and other aspects in perhaps lower cost areas, and who really become partners, not just vendors, for the people who have the actual customer relationships with the end buyers. And that's subject of a whole nother presentation. So my one to go on is this business model innovation. I really do think that that when everybody charges everything by the word and insists on pressing the risk off to somebody else, it just causes conflict. Of course the translators don't want to do the same work for half the price because machine translation is wonderful. All right? Show me. And on the other end of the spectrum, the translation vendors have invested a lot in their software, and of course they want just a penny a word. But we have to get away from that. There has to be some way of taking this to market. I'm helping one customer right now in the U.S. where we've got the the end buyer, the machine translation vendor, the LSP, and 3 key translators working together to try and find out what we can do in terms of improving speed and productivity and cost parameters. And once we figure that out, then we can start talking about how we share that risk and how we address the business model issues. And that takes a lot of trust and a lot of faith and includes its own amount of risk. But I think something like that has to happen and will happen. We'll do it, or someone will do it to us. Thank you.